And welcome back to Love Your Food. This week we have another recipe for you that's very similar to the Frybread we did recently, although we're giving a little bit of a twist. This is for an apple fritter, and we're also going to be adding a twist to this by using a yeast-leavened dough for this as well. So it's going to be a little bit different, but the technique is going to be remarkably similar, and here's our ingredients. So here's an apple, some cinnamon sugar, some milk, some plain sugar, just regular white sugar, some instant yeast, a little bit of salt, and some bread flour or all-purpose flour. So we're going to start by warming up the milk a little bit. We're going to add the sugar into the milk and add in the instant yeast. Now this is instant yeast, so it doesn't technically need to bloom. We can add this directly to whatever we're making, and it should just be fine. But we wanted to make this really yeasty, so we are going to give it a little head start here. We're going to add the salt to the flour. And if you, as we did, forgot to grab a fork, you can just mix that together with your finger until it's all well combined. And once that's done, we're going to start dealing with our apple. So we want to cut the core out. So we're just going to cut the two panels off the outside and then the smaller panels off either side of the core. And we want pretty small pieces of apple. We're just going to make a pretty fine dice here. So it's going to be nice small pieces, and we're going to give it a little bit of cooking before we add it to our dough. So you can see here, Chef Caleb is just trying to keep everything organized so that he can make nice small dice of these apples, these apple slices. And there we go. So that's about the size you want. And again, you want to try and keep everything about the same size so that it cooks at the same rate. And then some butter into our pan. Now we wanted to make sure that the butter was going to be a little bit cooked. We wanted a little bit of browning on the butter before we added the apples. So we let that just brown just a little tiny bit. It's hard to see on this pan. And then in go the apples. And we're just going to let these get a little bit of color. We just want them just barely softened and a little bit of color on there. A little bit of salt as well. And then we're just going to let those cook for a little while we get everything else together. Now, because we're making a yeast dough, we do want it to rest a little before we start mixing in the apples and we start adding it to the oil. So we are going to add in our mixture, that's the milk with the yeast and the sugar, and we're just going to stir that in until it makes a rough dough. Now, the way we do it here is probably not ideal, and in the instructions below, you're going to see Chef Caleb recommends that you add the apples to the milk and add that into the flour together because we did struggle a little bit to get the apples incorporated into these fritters because they were so they still had a little bit of oil on them from the pan, so they were, because of the butter on them, they didn't incorporate super easily into the dough that we'd already made. So we're just going to sprinkle a little bit of that cinnamon sugar on the apples that were cooked, and you can see they're just barely softened, and we've also taken about half of it out and set that aside for another use because there was way too much apple for the amount of dough that we made. And we're just going to stir that together. It gives it that beautiful caramel apple flavor. And then we're just going to add that into our dough and try and fold that together. So you can see here, this is where we started to struggle a little bit. And this is why Chef Caleb recommends that you add the apples at the same time as the milk, because it's going to help you sort of incorporate everything a little easier. Because we're just trying to fold it all together, and that slight oiliness from the outside of the apples really made it a bit of a challenge to get it all combined. But combine them we did, and we did manage to get it pretty much together. Here we are, Chef Caleb is just dividing the single piece of dough into equal pieces. We ended up with 8, so we just broke it into 4, and then each of those 4 into 2. And again, we let it rest for a little while just to let that yeast sort of proof and puff up a little bit, and it gave it a much lighter texture. We did try a couple right away, and they were fine, but after a little bit of time, there was a little bit more gluten development. There was a little bit better flavor. The yeast had a little bit more time to make air bubbles, and it was a little fluffier. The outside was crisper, so we do recommend waiting a little bit, letting it proof just a little before you add it to the hot oil. You do want to flip it a couple of times. You want to make sure, because they will float and part of it will not be under the oil. And then if your oil is the right temperature, you really won't have much oil in the dough. It shouldn't be oily when you're done, so just let them drain, and then you want to season with a little bit of that cinnamon sugar on top. And here's where you can sort of control the sweetness a little bit. If you want a little bit more, you can season both sides with that cinnamon sugar. And if you want it less sweetened, just add one side is fine. And there we go, still warm. You can see they're really nice and fluffy inside. They're nice and cakey. That outside was beautiful and crispy. The apples on the outside were really, really nicely caramelized. And the ones inside, because we had already cooked them, just weren't raw lumps of apple. They had a little bit of color to them as well. They were already cooked, and that really made the experience a little nicer all the way through. So we hope you'll give this one a try. If you like this recipe, please do like and subscribe, and if you have any recipes you'd like to see Chef Caleb try on the channel, please let us know in the comments below. And remember to love your food.